I was alive, but on that day I was being buried as if I were dead. Sitting just yards from the church in my old Buick, I watched as people entered dressed in black for my funeral. The person who organized everything, my own daughter, the same one who months earlier had looked me straight in the eyes and said, "You're dead to me. They say words can't hurt you, but that's a lie." When my daughter declared me dead over a car I couldn't afford to buy her, I felt something break inside me. So when she called from jail needing $50,000 bail money, I made a decision that would change both our lives forever. Now, as I watch my own empty casket being lowered into the ground, I'm forced to confront the hardest question of all. Is teaching her a lesson worth destroying what's left of our broken family? Follow the channel, like, and comment where you're watching from to discover the shocking truth of how far a father would go to make his daughter understand the power of her words. I was alive, but on that day, I was being buried as if I were dead. Sitting just a few yards from the church in my old Buick, I watched people entering dressed in black. It was my funeral, and the person who organized everything was my own daughter, the same one who months earlier had looked me straight in the eyes and said, "You're dead to me." The autumn wind swept through the parking lot, rustling the dying leaves that had fallen from the massive oak trees surrounding the small white church where I'd been baptized 68 years ago. I never imagined I'd be watching my own funeral from here, hidden behind tinted windows like some kind of ghost. I watched the cars arrive, the flower wreaths with my name, "Beloved Father, Robert Miller," the priest arranging the altar. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, not from fear, but from a deep, searing anger that had been building inside me for months. I didn't cry because I was dead. I cried because nobody there seemed to truly miss me. My daughter, Melissa, stood at the church entrance in an expensive black dress that probably cost more than my monthly pension. She greeted guests with practiced solemnity, accepting hugs and condolences with the perfect amount of grief on her face. But I knew better. I'd raised her for 32 years, watched her grow from a giggling little girl who chased fireflies in our backyard to the cold, calculating woman who now performed sorrow for an audience. The church bells began to ring, and my chest tightened. Through the half-open car window I could hear snippets of conversation. Poor Robert, gone so suddenly. Heart attack, wasn't it? Melissa must be devastated. Devastated? I almost laughed out loud. The same daughter who screamed that I was dead to her when I couldn't buy her a brand new Mercedes 3 months ago. The same daughter who hadn't called me once on my birthday 2 weeks later. The same daughter who now stood to inherit whatever meager savings and possessions I had left after 40 years of working at the steel mill. I shifted in my seat to get a better view. My back ached from sitting too long, but I couldn't miss this. I needed to see it all, every fake tear, every whispered conversation. I needed to know if she was actually mourning her father, or just the money she thought she would inherit. The church was filling up now. I recognized faces I hadn't seen in years. Cousins from Ohio, my brother-in-law from Florida, neighbors who had barely spoken to me since Martha died 5 years ago. They all came for the free sandwiches and to gawk at the spectacle of death, I supposed. No one had bothered to visit when I was alive. As the last guests filtered in, I noticed Mrs. Abernathy, my next-door neighbor for over 30 years, pause at the church steps. She looked around, confused, as if something wasn't right. For a moment, I feared she had spotted me, but then she shook her head and entered the church. I exhaled slowly. The plan had worked perfectly so far. After that late-night phone call from jail, after Melissa's desperate plea for $50,000 bail money, I had made my decision. If I was already dead to her, why not make it official? I'd spread the news of my heart attack through an old friend at the VFW hall who owed me a favor, arranged for an empty casket, and even paid for the church service with what little savings I had left. I'd written a fake obituary for the local paper, mentioning my sudden passing and my beloved daughter Melissa as my only survivor. Now I just needed to see how she would react. Would she cry real tears? Would she speak kindly of me? Or would she reveal her true colors? As the priest began the service, I turned up the small radio I had brought along, tuned to the frequency of the church's audio system, another favor from my friend's son who worked there on weekends. The hymns filtered through my car speakers, and then the priest's solemn voice. "We are gathered here today to remember Robert James Miller." I closed my eyes, listening to the platitudes about a man nobody really knew. Nobody except Martha, maybe, and she had been gone for 5 years. 5 long years of loneliness in that empty house, with only occasional visits from Melissa when she needed something. The priest invited people to share memories. There was a long silence and my heart sank even further. Did nobody have anything to say about my 68 years on this earth? Finally, I heard footsteps approaching the microphone. Then, Melissa's voice, clear and controlled. My father was a complicated man. I leaned forward, straining to hear every word. He worked hard his whole life, but he never really understood me. He was stubborn, old-fashioned. Each word felt like a knife. Even at my funeral, she couldn't find kindness. But he loved my mother more than anything in this world. And I know, her voice cracked slightly, I know he tried his best with me, even when we didn't see eye to eye. I felt something shift inside me. Was that guilt? No. She was just putting on a show. Then she said something that turned my blood cold. The last time we spoke, I said terrible things to him. Things I can never take back. I told him he was dead to me over something so stupid, so meaningless. She paused, and I heard what sounded like a genuine sob. And now he's really gone, and I never got to tell him I'm sorry. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. This wasn't part of the plan. She wasn't supposed to be sorry. She was supposed to be cold, calculating, focused on the inheritance, not standing there breaking down in front of everyone. The worst part, she continued, her voice now barely a whisper that the microphone still picked up, is that he died thinking I didn't love him. But I did. I always did. I was just too proud, too selfish to show it. I felt a tear roll down my cheek. No, this was wrong. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Then she said something that changed everything. Words that would haunt me and force me to reconsider every decision I had made. And now I'd give anything, anything at all, just to tell him one more time that I love him. Not for money, not for what he could give me, but just because he was my dad. Little did I know, as I sat there frozen in shock, that what I heard that day would transform all my pain into an irreversible decision, one that would either heal us both or destroy what little remained of our broken family forever. The words, "You're dead to me," don't just fade away. They linger, echoing in your mind during quiet mornings and keeping you awake at 3 a.m. That's how it was for me after Melissa spoke those words. It happened on a Tuesday last spring. I remember because it was raining. That soft, persistent kind of rain that seems to wash everything clean. But nothing felt clean about that day. I was sitting in my worn leather recliner, the one Martha and I had saved for months to buy back in '86. The leather was cracked now, the stuffing showing in places, but I couldn't bring myself to replace it. Martha had loved that chair. Sometimes I still caught her scent in it if I closed my eyes just right. The doorbell rang at exactly 11:17 a.m. I know because I glanced at the small clock on the mantel, another of Martha's treasures, as I pushed myself up with a grunt. My knee had been acting up again, a souvenir from 40 years at the steel mill. When I opened the door, Melissa stood there looking like a magazine cover, designer sunglasses perched on her head, holding back her perfectly highlighted hair, white blouse that probably cost more than my monthly pension check, that artificial smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Daddy," she said, stepping in without waiting for an invitation. She kissed the air near my cheek, careful not to smudge her lipstick. The house still smells the same. I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or criticism. With Melissa, it was hard to tell these days. "Coffee?" I offered, shuffling toward the kitchen. My slippers made a soft scraping sound against the hardwood floors that needed refinishing. "No time," she said, following me. "I just stopped by because I have amazing news." Something in her voice made me pause. Experience had taught me that Melissa's amazing news usually came with a price tag. We sat at the kitchen table, the same oak table where I'd taught her to play checkers, where she'd done her homework, where Martha and I had balanced our tight budget month after month. "I found it, Daddy," she said, sliding her phone across the table. "The perfect car." On the screen was a sleek silver Mercedes, all curves and chrome, looking like something from a different world than my 12-year-old Buick in the driveway. "Nice," I said, pushing the phone back toward her. "Congratulations." Her smile faltered. "No, Daddy. I found it for me, but I need your help with the down payment." The air in the kitchen suddenly felt heavier. "How much?" "Just $20,000, she said, as casually as if asking to borrow a cup of sugar. "I can handle the monthly payments myself." I stared at her, looking for some sign that she was joking. There wasn't any. "Melissa, I don't have that kind of money just sitting around. She waved her hand dismissively. You have your retirement account. Or you could take out a small loan against the house. The house is all I have, I said quietly. And my retirement account barely covers my expenses as it is. But Daddy, she said, leaning forward, I deserve this. I've been driving that Honda for 3 years now. 3 whole years. I almost laughed. I'd driven my previous car for 15 before it finally gave up. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I just can't. Her face changed then, hardening in a way that reminded me painfully of her mother when she was angry. The same tight jaw, the same narrowed eyes. But Martha's anger had always been righteous, justified. This was something else. You've always been like this, she said, her voice rising. Always saying no. Always acting like we're poor when you could help if you wanted to. We were poor, Melissa, I said, feeling a rare spark of anger. Your mother and I worked ourselves to the bone to put you through college. We never took vacations. We never bought new cars. Everything we had went to giving you a better life than we had. And look how that turned out, she snapped. Me, 32 years old, and still driving a car that's beneath me. Still living in an apartment instead of a house. Still waiting for my life to actually start. I sat back, genuinely stunned. Your life started the day you were born, Melissa, and it's been going on ever since. If you're waiting for something to make you happy, a car isn't going to do it. She stood up so suddenly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. You don't understand anything about my life or what I need. You never have. I understand that $20,000 for a down payment on a car you don't need isn't something I can give you. Her face flushed red. Mom would have found a way. That hurt more than anything else she could have said. Martha had been gone 5 years, and not a day passed when I didn't miss her like a physical ache. To have her memory used as a weapon against me felt like a betrayal of everything we'd been. Your mother understood the difference between wants and needs, I said quietly. She taught me that. I thought she taught you too. Melissa gathered her purse, her movements sharp with anger. You're a disappointment. You always have been. I stood up too, my knee protesting. I'm sorry you feel that way. She walked to the door, then turned back. Her eyes were cold in a way I'd never seen before. You're dead to me, she said, each word precise and deliberate. As far as I'm concerned, I don't have a father anymore. The door slammed behind her with such force that Martha's collection of small glass birds rattled on their shelf. One, a tiny blue jay that had been her favorite, fell and shattered on the hardwood floor. I stood there for a long time, looking at the broken pieces. Then I carefully swept them up and placed them in a small envelope that I tucked into my wallet. Somehow, it seemed important to keep them close. That night, I sat in Martha's in my bedroom, holding her photograph. What did we do wrong? I asked her smiling image. But of course there was no answer. I didn't know then that Melissa would call me 3 months later from jail. I didn't know I would conceive of a plan so extreme it bordered on cruelty. I just knew that something had broken between us that day. Something that, like Martha's little blue jay, might never be whole again. Sleep has always been a faithful companion to the elderly. Not for me, though. Ever since Martha passed, I'd grown accustomed to the gentle torture of insomnia. That's why I was wide awake at 2:17 a.m. when my phone rang that night. The harsh blue light illuminated my darkened bedroom as I fumbled for my glasses on the nightstand. An unknown number. My heart immediately quickened. Late-night calls rarely bring good news, especially to a man my age. Hello? My voice sounded rougher than I intended, scratchy from disuse. At first there was only background noise, muffled voices, a metallic clanging, someone shouting in the distance. Then I heard it. A breath. Shaky. Familiar in a way that reached back through decades. Dad? One word. Just one word, and I knew exactly who it was. But this wasn't the confident, demanding Melissa I'd seen 3 months ago. This voice was small, frightened, like when she was 7 and called me from a sleepover, wanting to come home because the other girls had told scary stories. Melissa? I sat up straighter, switching on the bedside lamp. What's wrong? Where are you? Another shaky breath. I'm in trouble, Dad. The background noise became clearer now, the distinctive echo of a large, sparse room. Voices calling out numbers and names, the unmistakable sound of metal doors closing. Are you in jail? I asked, though I already knew the answer. A small, choked sob confirmed it. Yes. My mind raced through possibilities. A DUI, perhaps? A bar fight? Melissa had always had a temper, even as a child. But what came next knocked the wind from my lungs. "I need your help, Dad. They've set bail at $50,000. $50,000. The number hung in the air between us, impossibly large. More than I had in my retirement account. More than I could possibly gather without selling the house. Martha's house. What happened?" I managed to ask, my free hand gripping the edge of the bedsheet so tightly my knuckles whitened. "It doesn't matter right now," she said, her voice hardening just slightly. A glimpse of the Melissa I knew returning. "What matters is getting me out of here. These people, Dad. You don't understand what it's like in here." I closed my eyes, picturing her, my only child, surrounded by concrete walls and steel bars. Despite everything, my heart ached for her. "Tell me what happened, Melissa," I insisted, my voice firmer now. "I need to know what I'm dealing with." A long pause followed, punctuated by what sounded like someone calling time warnings in the background. "It was a mistake," she finally said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I was at this party with some people from work. Someone brought cocaine. I just tried it. But the police raided the place and they're charging me with possession." My throat tightened. Martha would have known what to say. Martha always knew. I just felt lost, adrift between anger and concern. "Cocaine, Melissa? At your age? Don't lecture me right now." Her voice rose sharply, then immediately dropped again. "Please, Dad. I only have a minute left on this call. Can you help me or not?" The question hung between us like a physical thing. Could I help her? Yes, technically. I could sell the house, empty my accounts, maybe borrow from my brother. But should I? The memory of our last conversation flashed vividly in my mind. The look of contempt on her face, the casual cruelty of her words. "You're dead to me." Something hard and cold settled in my chest. "I'm still here," I said carefully. "Let me think for a moment." I heard her exhale with relief. "Thank you, Dad. Thank you. They said if the bail is posted, I could be out by morning. My lawyer thinks we can get the charges reduced, maybe even dismissed since it's a first offense. I just need to get out of here." Her voice had taken on that familiar tone, the one she used when she thought she was getting her way, the one that had always worked on me before. I stared at Martha's photograph on my nightstand. What would she have done? Martha had always been the stronger one of us, the one who could make the difficult choices when necessary. She believed in consequences, in tough love. "Hold on," I said, making my voice sound distracted. "Let me check something. Can you wait?" Yes, I'll wait," Melissa said, hope evident in her voice. "I still have a little time left." I set the phone down on the bed and just looked at it. In that moment, a plan began to form, terrible and perfect in its simplicity. If I was already dead to her, why not make it official? Let her face the consequences of her actions and her words. I picked up the phone again, but instead of speaking, I pressed the end call button. The screen went dark. I sat there in the dim light of my bedroom, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. The phone immediately began ringing again, the same unknown number. I watched it vibrate against my quilt, Martha's face smiling up at me from the photograph beside it. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to Melissa or to Martha's memory. The phone eventually stopped ringing, then started again. Stopped. Started. Like a heartbeat that wouldn't quit. After the fifth call, I turned it off completely and sat in the darkness. By the time dawn's gray light filtered through my curtains, I had made my decision. I would become what she already believed me to be. Dead. I spent that morning making calls. To an old friend at the VFW who owed me a favor. To a funeral director I'd known since high school. To my bank. By noon, Robert Miller was well on his way to being legally deceased. Heart attack, they'd say. Quick and unexpected. No one would question it too deeply. And somewhere across town in a county jail cell, my daughter waited for a father who would never come. A father who, by her own declaration, was already dead to her. Planning your own death requires attention to detail. That's something Martha taught me during our 43 years of marriage. The devil is always in the details. She would have been horrified by what I was doing, but I couldn't stop myself. The plan had taken root in my mind like a weed, growing stronger with each passing hour. The morning after Melissa's call, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, making lists. My handwriting, never particularly neat, had grown shakier with age, but I forced myself to write clearly. This was too important for mistakes. First, I needed to sell my car, A 2011 Buick LaCrosse with 87,000 miles on it. Not worth much, but enough to cover the funeral expenses. I called Frank down at Reliable Auto, who'd been maintaining my cars since before Melissa was born. Selling the Buick? Frank's voice crackled over the phone. But you love that car, Bob. Time for a change, I lied, staring out the window at the faded blue sedan in my driveway. Martha and I had brought Melissa home from college in that car. We'd taken our last vacation together to Myrtle Beach in it. Every dent and scratch held a memory. I can give you $4,200 for it, Frank said after a pause. Blue Book says $5,000, but you know how it is. That'll do, I replied, jotting down the figure on my pad. $4,000 would cover a basic funeral service with enough left over for other expenses. Next, I called Jimmy Dolan. We'd worked together at the mill for 30 years, and he owed me for covering his shifts when his son was sick back in '92. Jimmy had connections, the kind that could get things done without too many questions. I need a favor, Jimmy, I said when he answered. A big one. 2 hours later, Jimmy was sitting in my living room, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, his expression shifting between concern and confusion as I laid out my plan. Jesus, Bob, he whispered when I finished. This is something else. You're talking about faking your own death. That's illegal, you know. I shook my head. Not exactly. I'm not doing it for insurance fraud or to escape debts. I'm just disappearing for a while. Then I'll resurrect myself once the lesson is learned. Jimmy didn't look convinced. And what about the funeral home? The death certificate? That's where you come in, I said, leaning forward. Your cousin still works at Valley View Funeral Home, doesn't he? By the end of the day, Jimmy had reluctantly agreed to help. His cousin would provide an empty casket for the viewing, closed, of course, due to the condition of the body, and handle the paperwork without too many official channels. It would cost most of what I got for the Buick, but it would be worth it. The hardest part was writing my own obituary. I sat at Martha's old writing desk in the corner of our bedroom, the lamp casting a warm circle of light as evening settled in. What does one say about oneself? What legacy did I want to claim? After several crumpled attempts, I kept it simple. Robert James Miller, 68, passed away suddenly on August 3rd from a heart attack. A lifelong resident of Millfield, Bob worked at Millfield Steel for 40 years before retiring. He was preceded in death by his beloved wife, Martha. He is survived by his daughter, Melissa. Services will be held at Grace Episcopal Church on August 8th at 10 a.m. No mention of my volunteer work at the Veterans Hospital. Nothing about the literacy program I'd helped start at the local library after retirement. Those things weren't important to Melissa, so why include them? I arranged for the obituary to appear in the Millfield Gazette 3 days later. By then, word would have already spread through Jimmy and his network of old mill workers and VFW members. In a small town like Millfield, news, especially bad news, traveled faster than official announcements. The next challenge was figuring out where I would stay during and after the funeral. I couldn't remain in my house. Too many people knew me here. But I also couldn't go far without transportation. After selling the Buick to Frank, I'd need another way to get around. The solution came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Peterson, my neighbor of 30 years, stopped by with a casserole the day after I spoke with Jimmy. Word had already begun to spread that I wasn't well. Bob, she said, her eyes filled with concern. Jimmy Dolan's wife told me you've been having heart trouble. Why didn't you say something? I looked down, playing the part of the proud old man. Didn't want to worry anyone, Ellen. She set the casserole on the counter with a decisive thump. Well, that's just silly. Listen, my sister's going on a cruise next week and her house will be empty. Why don't you stay there while you're recovering? Get away from these stairs for a bit. And you can use her car too. She's leaving it at the airport. It was perfect. Almost too perfect. Ellen's sister lived in Coopersville, just 20 miles away. Far enough to be anonymous. Close enough to keep an eye on things here. That's very kind, I said, allowing a hint of relief to show. I might take you up on that. The final piece was the most difficult. How would I watch the funeral? I needed to see Melissa's reaction, needed to know if she felt anything real for the father she had declared dead months before. The answer came 2 days later when Jimmy stopped by with a set of keys. My nephew's car, he explained, dropping them into my palm. Tinted windows, good condition. He's away at college and won't miss it for a few days. You can park across from the church and no one will look twice. I closed my fingers around the keys, feeling their weight. Thank you, Jimmy. He shook his head, not meeting my eyes. I still think this is crazy, Bob, but I understand why you're doing it. Just don't take too long to come back to life, okay? People will be genuinely sad. That night, I packed a small suitcase with essentials, clothes, medications, Martha's photograph. I took one last look around the house where we'd raised our daughter, where Martha and I had built our life. The weight of what I was doing settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. Am I going too far? I asked Martha's photograph. Her smile offered no answer, but I could imagine what she'd say. Martha had always believed in consequences, but she'd also believed in forgiveness. Tomorrow I would die. In 5 days I would watch my own funeral from a borrowed car with tinted windows, and I would finally learn the truth about my daughter's heart. The morning of my funeral dawned with an ironic brightness. All blue skies and golden sunshine, birds singing in the maple trees as if nothing was wrong with the world. I'd barely slept in Ellen's sister's guest bedroom, my mind racing with doubts and second thoughts. But it was too late to turn back now. The obituary had run in yesterday's paper. The church was prepared. People would be gathering soon to mourn a man who was very much alive. I dressed carefully in clothes no one would recognize. A baseball cap pulled low, sunglasses, a plain gray sweatshirt I'd purchased at Walmart 2 days earlier. The face that looked back at me from the bathroom mirror seemed like a stranger's. Hollow-eyed, unshaven, older somehow than I'd been just a week ago. "You've gone too far this time, old man," I muttered to my reflection. But the stranger in the mirror just stared back, impassive and determined. Jimmy's nephew's car was a dark blue Honda Civic with windows tinted just enough to obscure the driver without looking suspicious. I'd driven it to the church an hour early, parking directly across the street with a clear view of the front steps. The small digital recorder Jimmy had lent me sat on the passenger seat, ready to capture the audio feed from the church's sound system, another favor from his network of connections. As I waited, I watched the funeral home van arrive, followed by workers carrying flower arrangements up the church steps. One large wreath caught my eye, white lilies and roses arranged around a ribbon that read, "Beloved Father." The sight of it made my stomach clench. Had Melissa ordered that? Or was it just a standard offering from the funeral home? The mourners began arriving around 9:30. Neighbors first, the Johnsons from across the street, old Mrs. Abernathy with her walker, the young couple who had moved in last year and whose names I could never remember, then former co-workers from the mill, most of them aging like me, moving slower than they once had. A few members of my weekly poker game, the librarian I'd volunteered with, more people than I'd expected, honestly. At 9:45, a sleek black Audi pulled up to the curb. My breath caught in my throat as Melissa stepped out, impeccably dressed in a fitted black dress and oversized sunglasses. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, emphasizing the sharp lines of her cheekbones. Martha's cheekbones. For a moment, the sight of her made my heart ache with a father's instinctive love, despite everything. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was no sign of redness around her eyes, no tissues clutched in her hand, no appearance of someone who had been crying or even losing sleep. She looked polished, composed, as if attending a business meeting rather than her father's funeral. I adjusted the small binoculars I'd brought, focusing more closely on her face as she paused at the top of the church steps to accept condolences from the pastor. Her expression was appropriately solemn, but there was something about the set of her mouth that seemed wrong somehow. Practiced, like an actress who had studied grief but never felt it. She disappeared inside the church and I switched on the digital recorder, adjusting the volume so I could hear the murmur of voices as people took their seats. The organ began to play softly. Amazing Grace, Martha's favorite hymn. The choice sent a pang through my chest. Had Melissa remembered that detail, or was it just a coincidence? The service began promptly at 10. I half listened to the pastor's opening words, the usual platitudes about life and death, about a man he barely knew. My attention was focused on trying to spot Melissa through the church's stained glass windows, but the colored panes obscured any clear view of the congregation. Instead, I concentrated on the audio. The pastor invited mourners to share memories. There was a long pause, and then a shuffling sound as someone approached the microphone. Bill Johnson, my next-door neighbor for 20 years, spoke briefly about our fence-building project and fishing trips. His wife mentioned Martha's Christmas cookies and how I'd continued the tradition after she passed. A former coworker told a mildly embarrassing story about my first day at the mill. Small memories, small kindnesses, the ordinary stuff of an ordinary life. Then I heard Melissa's voice, clear and controlled. "My father was a complicated man," she began, and I leaned closer to the recorder, straining to catch every nuance in her tone. We didn't always see eye to eye, especially in recent years, but he worked hard his whole life and did the best he could. Standard eulogy fare. Nothing particularly heartfelt or personal. I felt a heaviness settle in my chest. But then something unexpected happened. Through the open window of the church, carried on the summer breeze, I heard a sound that the microphone didn't pick up. Melissa's voice breaking slightly on her next words. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but the sudden murmur from the congregation suggested something significant had happened. I cursed silently, frustrated at missing whatever revelation might have occurred. 20 minutes later, the service concluded. I slumped back in my seat, emotionally drained just from watching and listening. The congregation began to file out, heading toward their cars for the procession to the cemetery where an empty casket would be buried in the plot next to Martha. I was about to start the car and follow at a distance when I saw something that made me freeze. Melissa had stepped away from the main group and was standing alone near a large oak tree at the edge of the church property. Her shoulders were shaking. Was she crying? Actually crying? Through the binoculars, I watched as she pulled a tissue from her purse and dabbed at her eyes, careful not to smudge her makeup. But then she did something that confused me even more. She took out her phone and made a call, speaking briefly while gesturing with her free hand. When she hung up, she straightened her shoulders and rejoined the group. Her momentary vulnerability vanished. As she passed near a cluster of my former coworkers, I saw her lean in to speak to Tom Jenkins, who had been my supervisor at the mill. Thanks to the window being partially open, a breeze carried her words directly to where I sat. At least now I can resolve my problems with the inheritance. The words hit me like a physical blow. So that was it. The tears, if they were even real, were for show, or perhaps for what the money could do for her, not for the father she had lost. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, and confirmed what I had suspected all along. I had been right to disappear, right to let her believe I was gone, right to make her face the consequences of declaring me dead to her. But as I watched her climb into her Audi to lead the procession to the cemetery, a small voice in the back of my mind, a voice that sounded suspiciously like Martha's, whispered, "What if you're wrong? What if there's more to her grief than you can see from across a street, through tinted windows and judgment clouded by hurt?" I pushed the thought away. I had come too far to doubt myself now. The funeral procession pulled away from the church, a line of cars with headlights on in the bright summer morning, carrying my empty casket to an empty grave. And I, the ghost they were burying, sat alone in a borrowed car, more uncertain than ever about what I had set in motion. I didn't follow the funeral procession to the cemetery. Something about watching them lower an empty casket into the ground beside Martha's grave felt like a step too far, a mockery of death that might invite real tragedy. Instead, I drove back to Ellen's sister's house, the recording of my own funeral service playing softly through the car speakers. The house was quiet and unfamiliar, beige walls adorned with beach vacation photos of people I didn't know, furniture that was too modern and uncomfortable for my taste. I sat heavily on the edge of the pristine white couch, my bones aching from the tension of the morning. I rewound the recording to the moment I'd missed, when Melissa's voice had broken. The audio was fuzzy, but I could make out her words now. My father always was complicated. He didn't give me everything I wanted, but he gave what he could. I wish I had understood that earlier. There was a pause, filled with the soft sounds of people shifting in their seats. The last time we spoke, I said terrible things to him, things I can never take back now. Another pause, longer this time. I leaned closer to the recorder, straining to hear. I told him he was dead to me over something so stupid, so meaningless. And now he really is gone, and I can never tell him I'm sorry. Her voice cracked on the last word, dissolving into what sounded like a genuine sob. The recording captured the rustle of movement, someone comforting her perhaps. And then she continued, her voice steadier but still thick with emotion. "The worst part is knowing he died thinking I didn't love him. But I did. I always did. I was just too proud, too selfish to show it." I sat back, a strange hollowness expanding in my chest. This didn't fit the narrative I'd constructed. The cold, calculating daughter who cared only for what I could give her. These words sounded sincere, heartfelt. But then, what about what I'd heard with my own ears outside the church? At least now I can resolve my problems with the inheritance. The contradiction gnawed at me as I replayed both moments in my mind. Which was the real Melissa? The grief-stricken daughter pouring out regrets to a congregation of mourners? Or the pragmatic woman discussing inheritance before my body was even in the ground? The recording continued, and I heard the pastor invite others to speak. There was shuffling, then a new voice, one I recognized immediately as Bill Jenkins, my poker buddy for the last 15 years. Bob wasn't perfect, Bill's gruff voice began. He could be stubborn as a mule and cheap as they come when it was his turn to buy a round. A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the congregation, but he was the most loyal friend a man could ask for. When my Jean was sick with cancer, Bob showed up every single day. Not to talk, not to offer empty platitudes, but to mow my lawn, fix my leaky sink, bring over casseroles that he'd learned to make from Martha's recipes. He'd just nod, do what needed doing, and leave. That's the kind of man he was. I felt my throat tighten. I hadn't done those things for recognition or thanks, just because it was what neighbors did for each other, what Martha would have expected of me. Several others spoke. Brief anecdotes, kind words. More than I deserved, probably. The pastor concluded with a prayer, and then the recording captured the sounds of the congregation rising, the soft murmur of conversations resuming. I switched it off and sat in the quiet house, surrounded by a stranger's belongings, feeling more alone than I had since Martha died. What had I done? Created an elaborate lie to teach my daughter a lesson? Or was I simply running away from the pain of her rejection, hiding behind a fake death rather than facing the broken relationship between us? The question haunted me throughout the afternoon as I paced the unfamiliar rooms, avoiding windows in case anyone from town happened to drive by. By evening, restlessness drove me to risk a trip to the cemetery. I needed to see the fresh grave, to make this bizarre situation feel real somehow. I waited until dusk, when the lengthening shadows would provide additional cover. The cemetery was empty when I arrived, the evening light painting the rows of headstones in soft gold. I parked Jimmy's nephew's car on a side road and approached on foot, keeping to the tree line. Martha's grave was in the eastern section, beneath an old maple tree that turned brilliant red in the fall. We'd chosen the spot together during those difficult discussions that couples in their 60s force themselves to have. "Promise you'll be right beside me," she'd said, and I'd promised, never imagining that her beside would come so soon, or that my grave would be an empty pretense. As I neared her plot, I saw the fresh mound of dirt beside her headstone. Flower arrangements from the funeral were arranged carefully around it, their sweet scent mingling with the earthy smell of newly turned soil. Someone had placed a temporary marker there. Robert James Miller, 1957-2025, beloved father. Beloved. The word made my chest ache. Had I been beloved, or merely useful, a source of financial support and practical assistance? I stood there in the gathering darkness, hat pulled low over my eyes, struggling with emotions I couldn't name. Grief for a life I had voluntarily abandoned. Anger at Melissa's callous words. Confusion over her seemingly contradictory behavior. And beneath it all, a deep, persistent loneliness that had been my constant companion since Martha's death. A sound behind me made me turn sharply. Someone was coming up the path that wound through the cemetery. A slender figure in black, moving with purpose. Melissa. I ducked behind a large monument, heart pounding in my chest. From my hiding place, I watched as my daughter approached the fresh grave. She stood there for a long moment, head bowed. Then, to my surprise, she sank to her knees beside it, her shoulders beginning to shake with silent sobs. "I'm sorry, Dad," I heard her whisper, her voice carrying in the still evening air. "I'm so sorry for what I said. I didn't mean it. I was just angry and stupid and now it's too late." She placed something on the grave, a small object I couldn't identify in the fading light. Then she rose, wiped her eyes, and walked back the way she had come, passing within 10 feet of where I crouched, frozen and speechless. When she was gone, I approached the grave again. There, placed carefully on the center of the fresh dirt, was a small glass figurine, a blue jay, identical to the one of Martha's that had broken the day Melissa stormed out of my house. I picked it up, turning it over in my trembling hands. How had she known? How had she remembered that insignificant detail from her mother's collection? Standing there in the gathering darkness, holding the delicate glass bird, I was forced to confront a possibility I had been avoiding. That perhaps I didn't know my daughter as well as I thought I did. That perhaps there was more to her grief, and to her, than I had been willing to see. The day of the burial dawned gray and humid, the air hanging heavy with the promise of rain. I watched from a distance as they lowered the empty casket into the ground next to Martha, unable to shake the eerie feeling of witnessing my own funeral. Jimmy had arranged everything perfectly. The gravediggers, the funeral director, the small gathering of mourners standing around the fresh rectangular hole in the earth. I'd parked the borrowed car behind a cluster of massive oak trees at the far edge of the cemetery, using a pair of binoculars to observe the proceedings. Even from this distance, I could make out Melissa's slender figure standing at the graveside, her black dress a stark contrast against the weathered gray headstone surrounding her. The pastor said a few final words that the wind carried away before they reached me, and then, one by one, the mourners stepped forward to drop flowers onto the descending casket. Melissa went last. She stood for a long moment at the edge of the grave, a single white rose clutched in her hands. Then, instead of simply dropping it like the others had done, she knelt and gently placed it on top of the casket. The gesture seemed so genuine, so full of grief, that for a moment I questioned everything I thought I knew about my daughter. As the small group dispersed, heading back to their cars, Melissa remained. The gravediggers waited at a respectful distance, leaning on their shovels while she stood motionless beside the open grave. Even through the binoculars, I couldn't make out her expression clearly, but something about the set of her shoulders spoke of a profound weariness. Finally, she turned away, but instead of following the path back to the parking area, she walked in a different direction, away from the other mourners, deeper into the cemetery. I tracked her movement, curious and increasingly concerned as she wound her way through the headstones, finally stopping at a spot beneath a large maple tree. With a start, I realized she was standing at Martha's grave, my wife's final resting place, now right next to my own empty one. From this distance, I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could see her lips moving as she spoke to her mother's headstone. Was she seeking comfort, forgiveness, or simply reporting that I had finally joined Martha in death? Rain began to fall then, gentle at first and then with increasing intensity. The grave diggers pulled on yellow slickers and began their work, shoveling dirt onto my empty casket. Melissa didn't move, seemingly oblivious to the downpour that was quickly soaking her expensive black dress and plastering her hair to her skull. An inexplicable urge to go to her, to reveal myself and end this charade, swept over me, but I remained frozen in place, watching as she finally knelt between the two graves, her mother's weathered one and my fresh one, and placed her hands flat on the muddy earth, her head bowed. It was such a private moment of grief that I felt like a voyeur, an intruder on pain that I myself had manufactured. I lowered the binoculars, a hollow feeling expanding in my chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to be cold, calculating, focused on the inheritance, not kneeling in the mud between her parents' graves, shoulders shaking with what could only be sobs. After what seemed like an eternity, Melissa rose and walked slowly back toward the cemetery entrance, a solitary black figure moving through curtains of rain. I waited until she was out of sight before starting the car and driving to the cemetery's service entrance at the rear, where I'd arranged to meet Jimmy. He was waiting in his rusty pickup truck, a cigarette dangling from his lips despite having quit 10 years ago after his heart attack. "It's done," he said simply when I climbed into the passenger seat, dripping rainwater onto his cracked vinyl seats. "Did anyone suspect anything?" I asked, unable to keep the edge of anxiety from my voice. Jimmy shook his head. "Nah. Closed casket, remember? And my cousin at the funeral home took care of the paperwork. As far as the world's concerned, Robert Miller is 6 feet under." We sat in silence for a moment, listening to the rain drum on the roof of the truck. "You should have seen her, Jimmy," I finally said, my voice barely audible above the storm. "At the grave. She looked broken." Jimmy took a long drag of his cigarette, the cherry glowing bright in the gray light. "Maybe because she is, Bob. Maybe because she just lost her father. But she's the one who said I was dead to her," I argued, the familiar anger rising again. "She didn't want me in her life." "People say things they don't mean when they're angry," Jimmy replied, flicking ash out the cracked window. "Doesn't mean they want those words to come true." His simple wisdom hit me like a physical blow. Had I overreacted? taken her heated words too literally and responded with a cruelty that far outweighed her offense. "It's not too late to fix this, you know," Jimmy continued, his weathered face serious in the dim light. "You could tell her the truth. Explain why you did it." I shook my head, thinking of Melissa standing alone in the rain and then of her words at the church. "At least now I can resolve my problems with the inheritance." "No," I said firmly. "She needs to learn that there are consequences to her actions, to her words. This is the only way she'll understand." Jimmy sighed, a sound full of disappointment that reminded me uncomfortably of Martha. "Whatever you say, Bob. It's your funeral." He paused, then chuckled dryly. "Literally, I guess." He drove me back to Ellen's sister's house in silence, the wipers beating a hypnotic rhythm against the windshield. As we pulled into the driveway, he turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Just don't wait too long to come back to life," he said. "The longer a lie goes on, the harder it is to undo." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and climbed out of the truck. The rain had eased to a fine mist, but I was already soaked through, chilled to the bone in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Inside the empty house, I changed into dry clothes and made a cup of coffee, trying to sort through the tumultuous emotions of the day. The image of Melissa kneeling between the graves, hands pressed to the muddy earth, kept returning to me. It didn't fit with the narrative I'd constructed of her as selfish and uncaring, interested only in what material things I could provide. As evening fell, bringing with it a symphony of crickets and the occasional distant rumble of thunder, I found myself drawn to the small guest room closet where I'd hidden the few personal items I'd brought from home. From an old shoebox, I carefully removed a stack of photographs, visual markers of a life now officially ended. There was Martha on our wedding day, young and radiant in a simple white dress. Martha holding newborn Melissa, her face a mixture of exhaustion and wonder. Melissa on her first bicycle, gap-toothed and grinning. Melissa at her high school graduation, looking so much like her mother that it made my heart ache. I lingered over a photo I'd almost forgotten. Melissa at about 8 years old helping me build a birdhouse in the backyard. Her small hands were wrapped around a hammer that seemed comically large for her, her face screwed up in concentration. I remembered that day clearly now, how she'd accidentally hit my thumb with the hammer, how I'd yelped in pain, and how her eyes had immediately filled with tears not of fear but of concern for me. When had that empathetic child become the woman who could look me in the eyes and say, "You're dead to me"? Or had she always been both, capable of both cruelty and compassion, just like all of us? I returned the photos to their box and sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed, the blue jay figurine Melissa had left on my grave clutched in my hand. Its delicate glass wings caught the last light of day streaming through the window, casting small rainbows across the wall. Something wasn't adding up. The Melissa who had declared me dead, who had spoken of inheritance while I was being eulogized, didn't seem like the same person who had knelt in the mud between two graves, who had remembered her mother's broken blue jay and replaced it as a final gift. As night fell completely, I came to an uncomfortable realization. Perhaps I didn't know my daughter as well as I thought I did, and perhaps this elaborate deception was revealing more about me than it was about her. The days following my funeral blended together in a strange limbo. I existed but didn't exist. I was alive but officially dead. The contradiction wore on me more than I expected, creating a hollow feeling in my chest that expanded with each passing hour. 2 weeks after they buried the empty casket, Jimmy called to tell me Melissa had returned to my house. Her house now, I supposed, and was going through my belongings. Something about the image of her sorting through the physical remnants of my life made me uneasy. I had to see for myself. I drove past my house 3 times before finding the courage to park across the street. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the familiar porch where Martha and I had spent countless summer evenings. Melissa's sleek Audi sat in the driveway, looking out of place next to the weathered swing set I'd never had the heart to dismantle after she grew up. From my vantage point, I could see movement through the living room window. Melissa appeared carrying a cardboard box, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked different somehow, thinner, less polished than usual. She set the box down and disappeared from view again. For nearly an hour, I watched as she carried boxes in and out, occasionally stopping to examine something, sometimes setting items aside with what appeared to be special care. What was she keeping? What was she discarding? The questions gnawed at me like physical hunger. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. Melissa emerged onto the porch. She sat heavily on the top step, shoulders slumped in obvious exhaustion. Then she did something unexpected. She pulled something from her pocket and held it to her face. It took me a moment to recognize my old pipe, the cherry wood one Martha had given me for our 20th anniversary. I hadn't smoked it in years, not since Martha's diagnosis, but I'd kept it on my dresser, a tangible reminder of happier times. Melissa brought the pipe to her nose, inhaling deeply, and the realization hit me with surprising force. She was trying to remember my scent. The thought created a painful tightness in my throat. She sat there for a long time, cradling the pipe, occasionally wiping at her eyes. Was she actually mourning me? The question circled in my mind, challenging everything I thought I knew about my daughter, about our relationship. As darkness fell, she finally rose and went back inside. Lights came on in the house, illuminating windows that framed scenes from a life that no longer belonged to me. Through the kitchen window, I could see her moving about, making tea in the chipped blue mug I'd always used. Such a small thing, but it pierced me unexpectedly. The thought that she might be seeking connection through these trivial objects, these fragments of who I had been. I was about to leave when a taxi pulled up in front of the house. A man got out, tall, expensively dressed, with the kind of confident bearing that immediately set my teeth on edge. He paid the driver and strode up to my front door, knocking with an assertiveness that seemed presumptuous. Melissa answered quickly, as if she'd been expecting him. Her body language changed instantly, shoulders straightening, chin lifting, a hand rising to smooth her hair. I recognized the transformation with a father's painful clarity. This was someone she wanted to impress. They spoke briefly at the door before she let him in. Through the windows, I watched their interaction with growing unease. He moved through my house with an entitled ease, picking up objects, examining them, occasionally making comments that caused Melissa to nod or shake her head. At one point, he gestured expansively around the living room, saying something that made Melissa frown. After about 20 minutes, they emerged onto the porch. The man was speaking animatedly, hands moving to emphasize whatever point he was making. Melissa stood with her arms crossed, her expression difficult to read in the dim porch light. Could easily get $180,000 for it in this market, I heard him say as his voice carried across the quiet evening. Even without major renovations, with some updates to the kitchen and bathrooms, maybe $2,000 and $20,000. Real estate agent. He was assessing my home, Martha's home, for sale. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I don't know, Melissa replied, her voice softer but still audible in the still night. It's a lot to think about right now. Of course, the man said smoothly. You've just lost your father. Take your time, but don't wait too long. Market's hot right now. He handed her a business card, let his hand linger on hers a moment too long, then departed in the waiting taxi. Melissa remained on the porch, looking at the card, then out at the darkened street, looking, it seemed, directly at where I sat hidden in Jimmy's nephew's car. For a terrifying moment, I thought she'd spotted me, but then she sighed deeply and went back inside, closing the door firmly behind her. I sat there for a long time, digesting what I'd seen and heard. She was planning to sell the house where she'd grown up, where Martha and I had built our life together, the house I'd maintained meticulously since Martha's death, preserving it as a kind of shrine to our family as it once was. The thought should have angered me. It should have confirmed my worst suspicions about her materialistic priorities. Instead, I found myself wondering, what else could she do? She had her own home, her own life. What use would she have for a modest 3-bedroom in an aging neighborhood, filled with memories that might be more painful than precious? As I finally drove away, the image that stayed with me wasn't of Melissa and the real estate agent discussing property values. It was of my daughter sitting alone on the porch steps, holding my old pipe to her face, seeking some last connection to the father she believed was gone forever. Back at Ellen's sister's house, I couldn't sleep. I paced the unfamiliar rooms, my mind racing with conflicting emotions. The plan had been so clear at the beginning. Let Melissa believe I was dead, let her face the consequences of her cruel words, perhaps even learn a valuable lesson about the fragility of life and relationships. But now, watching her actual grief, her actual struggle to make sense of my absence, I felt like the cruel one. The punishment no longer seemed to fit the crime. A moment of anger, of entitled frustration, met with an elaborate deception that was causing genuine pain. At dawn, I made a decision. I would write her a letter, not to reveal myself, not yet, but to offer some guidance, some closure. I would include it in my will, which Jimmy had arranged to have delivered to her through my lawyer in a few days. I sat at the small desk in the guest room, pen hovering over paper, struggling to find words that might bridge the gulf between us. How do you speak to someone from beyond the grave? What wisdom can a father offer when he has committed the ultimate betrayal of trust? In the end, I kept it simple. Melissa, you once told me I was dead to you. Now that I am, I hope you'll consider what that really means. Not just the absence of financial support or practical help, but the absence of possibility, the chance to speak words left unsaid, to heal wounds left open. I didn't leave you money. Money was always what stood between us, what you valued more than our relationship. Instead, I left you memories, photographs, letters, the tangible evidence that we were once a family who loved each other. I also left you the house, not to sell, but to keep, to remember. It's yours on one condition, that you bring a single flower to my grave, not out of obligation, but as a symbol that you understand what matters in the end isn't what we have, but who we love. If you can do this, the house is yours. If not, it will be sold and the proceeds donated to the Veterans Hospital where I volunteered. The choice is yours, as it always has been. Dad, I sealed the letter in an envelope, my hands trembling slightly. Whether it would bring healing or more pain, I couldn't say. But it felt like the only truth I could offer from my self-imposed exile from life. Jimmy came by later that day to collect the letter from my lawyer. He read it with a furrowed brow, then handed it back without comment. "How long are you going to keep this up, Bob?" he finally asked as he prepared to leave. I looked out the window at the unfamiliar street, the unfamiliar houses, the unfamiliar lives being lived all around me. "I don't know," I admitted. "I thought I'd know when it was time to end it, when she'd learned whatever lesson I was trying to teach." I sighed heavily. Now I'm not sure what the lesson was supposed to be. Jimmy clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Maybe you're the one who needed to learn something." He left me standing there, his words echoing in my mind like an accusation. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps this elaborate scheme had revealed more about my own failings as a father than it had about Melissa's as a daughter. I watched his truck disappear down the street, the letter that might be my last communication with my daughter tucked safely in his pocket. The gulf between Melissa and me now seemed wider than ever, no longer just the result of her harsh words or my hurt feelings, but of a deliberate deception that might prove impossible to forgive. Sometimes the wounds that cut deepest are the ones inflicted by those we love most. The words "you're dead to me" became a self-fulfilling prophecy, not just for my daughter but for me as well. In my attempt to teach her about consequences, I created consequences I never imagined. We both lost precious time that can never be recovered. What would you have done in my place? When someone declares you dead to them, is it better to accept their judgment and disappear, or to fight for the relationship even when it seems beyond repair? The line between teaching a life lesson and cruel revenge is thinner than we think, and crossing it can change us in ways we never anticipated. Perhaps the hardest lesson I learned wasn't about my daughter's character, but about my own. Family is complicated, messy, painful, and imperfect, but it's also irreplaceable. Whether you're a parent who feels unappreciated or a child whose spoken words you regret, remember that time is the one thing we can never get back once it's gone. Follow this channel for more stories that will make you think twice about the power of your words, and share this with someone who might need to hear it before it's too late.